Hello and welcome to Tigers by the Fire, a podcast out of Holy Cross High School about World War II discussions and stories. With me today are Josh Adams.
Hi, I'm Josh Adams.
Jack Armstrong.
Hello.
And Gunnar Guidry.
Hello.
And today, this is episode 1 of season 5 of this podcast. We're going to be talking about Pointe du Hoc, which I think is a really interesting story centered around D-Day. And obviously, I think a lot of people, if you're listening to a World War II podcast, or you may not be, most people know a little bit about D-Day, June 6, 1944. 150,000 Allied soldiers landing to help liberate France, right, in Normandy, France. Pointe du Hoc is in between kind of Omaha Beach and Utah Beach. It is a high elevated position, and they're going to kind of go over this, but it's one of these things that is almost like mythologized in the U.S. Army's traditions. The Army Rangers especially, there's a big monument over there, and it's one of the things that they kind of really look to. But if you're looking at D-Day as a whole, if you're wondering how big it is, we're talking about an event that featured over 6,000 ships, 50,000 vehicles, 11,000 planes, like we said, 150,000 people. In terms of like countries involved, the United States, obviously, Great Britain, obviously, and Canada were the most involved. But there's also Polish people involved, the Free Polish Fighters, and of course, the Polish Air Corps that comes out of Britain, and as well as the Free French and Belgians, and it's multiple nations all across the board. And so this is one of the most coordinated assaults ever, and it's the biggest amphibious assault of the whole war and in human history. And I am going to turn it over to our guys, and they're going to kind of give you a little brief intro.
So D-Day obviously is going to be essential to an Allied victory and regaining control in Western Europe. And Pointe du Hoc is actually essential to this plan. It's the 2nd Ranger Battalion is going to be one of the first groups that's going to land on D-Day to take out 155 millimeter caliber guns that are stationed on Pointe du Hoc. And Pointe du Hoc it's a 100-foot high cliff, and these guns are pointed down. At least what the intelligence said is that these guns are pointed down towards Omaha and Utah Beach, and they could be catastrophic if they're not destroyed and take out a lot of Allied soldiers.
Yeah, so to Jack's point, we're talking about like big anti-personnel guns. They're not really worried about them shooting at the ships, the Navy, but they're worried about them on the beaches. And to his point, the thought was that especially on Omaha Beach, these guns would wreak havoc on the Allied landing craft. Gunnar?
So the leader of the 2nd Ranger Battalion was Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, and alongside him was Captain Little, Frank Little, he led the D Company, and Captain Goranson led the C Company. And both of them, all three of them had to make things on fly. This did not go smoothly by any means. And so it was great leadership on their behalf rather than everything that went along with it that was wrong.
Yeah, so like Jack mentioned, the task that was Pointe du Hoc was scaling a 100-foot vertical cliff while being shot at. You can imagine how hard that is, but you don't really get a really good grasp of how difficult something like that would have been like unless you've seen it and been there. And I had the privilege to go there over the summer and see what took place at Pointe du Hoc and actually give a briefing there. And the visuals and how it looked really, really, they paint the picture. There's hardly any beach. Part of that's due to erosion, but still in 44, there wasn't much beach to begin with. You can see the giant craters the naval bombardments put everywhere in that area. These craters are huge, about the size of a classroom, very extremely large craters. And then you see how far the drop is. And to think that soldiers were under fire, hearing chaos and explosions, and their grappling equipment didn't work, and their buddies were drowning in sinkholes from the bombardment. Thinking like what they were going through and getting this visual really does paint a picture for what it was like to be there. And just saying 100-foot vertical cliff, that doesn't really do it justice to what that task was like.
Yeah, and to Josh's point, and I know going there this summer, it was quite the eye opener, right? Like when you read about it, you had learned about it, and then when you actually saw it, you see it gives you a greater appreciation for what they've overcome. And I think the point that you also made about the beaches is really important. Like there is not much beach there at all. This isn't like them landing on 100 yards of beach. We're talking feet, instead of like, tens and hundreds of yards. So very good. I know the leadership, and Gunnar brought this up, this is the Army Rangers too. Like this is the best trained people in the U.S. Army, and so that's something to kind of keep in mind. And they focus really hard to get this done. And it's something we'll talk about in a second. So.
More on Rudder's leadership. Rudder in this battalion is a really motivated figure. Now he isn't meant to be present at the mission, but he is going to be due to later events that Gunnar is going to talk about. Rudder was very present on base, very idolized by the men, and his decision-making, especially in the hours leading up to the assault, which was very chaotic, he put up with a lot of last-minute changes, a lot of pressure from other officers and disagreements, and his resolute attitude in that is what makes him such an effective leader. It's really it's a great achievement by Rudder to make this mission be successful, even when there was so much chaos going on.
And if I can add, despite how strict and discipline-oriented he was, his men still loved him. They still championed him as one of their favorite people to serve for. Like, despite the fact that he didn't have like close personal relationships with them, they got the sense that this resolute attitude that Jack mentioned that he had about himself showed that he cared for the men and what they were trying to accomplish, and they had a lot of respect for that.
And then I think it's also because he does what they do. He does not sit in the back, and as you guys said, and I think you're about to talk about, he wasn't originally supposed to even come on this mission, but he gets put on it. But in the training process, I mean, he's doing the same thing they're doing, and I think that's important to understand. Gunnar?
So I'm actually going to add a little bit onto Captain Frank Little. Before I dive into him, I just want to say a quick little like kind of story about him to just show the character of him. And so at one of the pre-D-Day briefings, he showed up drunk, and when he was there, he may or may not have admitted to the fact that he feels like this mission, and spread his doubts on the mission, and was like the chances of success is minimum because it's a near impossible mission that they happen to overcome. And he talks about how he's just aware of how this is just kind of just a little crazy. He's supposed to be the highest official there. Captain Frank Little is supposed to be the highest official on the beach that day, but Rudder ends up tagging along with him because he knows his job as a leader is Joshua.
Well, I was actually going to say Little never goes aboard. He's actually restrained, and he actually says this mission is a suicide mission. He had more of a relationship with his men. He was more of like a personal guy, and he thought he was about to lead a charge of men to their death. He felt like he couldn't in good conscience, as the highest ranking person that was going to be storming Pointe du Hoc that day, he couldn't in good conscience lead his men ashore. He couldn't do that. So he was restrained, and Rudder, being the leader that he is, being this resolute man that he was, he decided, I'm going to take the charge. I'm going to lead the men ashore instead of Little. Little was eventually reinstated in his position, but was put on leave for a time.
And yeah, Little was pretty much like the opposite of Rudder. Rudder, like Jack mentioned, was a very motivational, very serious person. Little showing up drunk showed a lot of who he was, kind of. He was more of a humorous leader. Even though he was like that, he was still very determined and took everything serious, but he was just like the humorous kind of coach yeah.
Yeah, and I think the thing to consider when you look at Little is he's concerned about his men. And so as Josh kind of put it, and you kind of put it, like he has a close relationship with them. He has severe doubts that this is going to work. And this brings up a conversation, for the biggest thing is, the event as a whole is, should this have ever happened? And that's something I know Josh talked about in his briefing when we were there, and then got randomly questioned by some British people. But it was something that is something that historians debate over. And in the military, they were debating over it too. Like, is this a worthwhile venture? Is it not? But Rudder was like, this is what we're assigned, and so we're going to do it, and we're going to do it to the best of our abilities, I think. And that's the biggest difference between the two. But, the training and everything, Little does all the training. Like, he's the one who gets them ready to do this. And without that, this doesn't happen. I think that's important to recognize too.
Now, the strategy for Pointe du Hoc, the assault itself will not go to plan, but the strategy carefully outlined by Eisenhower and other top generals is going to involve the 2nd Ranger Battalion doing with all 6 companies, A through F, completing the assault on the point itself. So each company has 2 platoons with 65 men and 3 officers. Each platoon is going to have 2 rifle sections, a mortar section, and a machine gun section. These are the best regulars in the Army. These are the most well-trained, some of the most talented soldiers. Now, strategy, the A and B company would launch an invasion from directly in front of the point. Company C would be following Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment down the right flank of Omaha Beach and attacking from a higher point to cover for the A and B company. So companies A and B of the 2nd Ranger Battalion were completely relying on C for cover fire. D, E, and F, companies D, E, and F would land at the point. D would scale the western cliff and E and F would scale the eastern cliff. Rudder, again, was not supposed to be present, but he is going to land with D, E, and F later due to other complications. So all the companies in this were relying on each other completely for the success of this mission, and it is not going to go nearly to plan. And Josh is going to talk about that next.
So right, so companies A, B, and D, E, and F were all supposed to land around 6:30 a.m. roughly. They had a feeling that things weren't going to go exactly to plan, but they were intended to land at 6:30 a.m. Due to the tides washing the boats downstream towards the east, Rudder ran into complications where he had to try and get his coxswain. He was a British coxswain to redirect the boats so that he could still make it to his objective. Actually, Company C had a similar issue, and they didn't have anyone to take the initiative to change the direction of the boats. And actually, they end up near Vierville Draw and are never able. And partially because the 116th takes such heavy casualties, they're never able to get to Pointe du Hoc and to make a difference in the fight. But Rudder, after arguing with the British coxswain, gets him to redirect his course, and he does make it to Pointe du Hoc, but he's 45 minutes late, and he doesn't have the assistance of Company C coming from the flank to assist him. So then they engage the 5 companies that do make it, and they don't assault from the angles that they're supposed to be assaulting from, but they're late, and they get into a 2-hour struggle in which I believe 75 of the 225 men die. They're fighting for 2 days, and after 2 days of fighting, when they're finally relieved, only 90 men stood in fighting position. Only 90 men could take up arms.
Yeah, and that was out of over 200.
Yeah.
Yep.
225.
Yeah, and things to consider too, as Josh is talking about them coming up. Remember, D-Day got postponed for 24 hours because of heavy rain and everything else. So the English Channel, which is not a docile body of water ever, is very, very choppy, right? So there's streams going through it. The water's going up and down. So you have to imagine these guys, right? They're in their Higgins boats and they're getting sick, right? They're throwing up. They're just, it is a messed up situation. And most of them haven't slept, I think is also something we should remember. Most of these guys haven't slept in a day or 2 days. So there's a lot of sleep deprivation. They're not feeling too good. And then, of course, like you said, nothing really goes to plan. One of the images, and I know, whenever I bring groups there, we talk about, like, imagine being in that boat and you see these rockets being launched from the ships.
And hit the water.
Yeah, and they hit the water right in front of you. So they don't hit the cliffs. They miss. They hit the water.
Morale.
And morale is bad. And then when people, if the boats land early and you get out and all of a sudden there's this, like, crater in the ground that you can't see that's covered in water, people go 10 feet underwater. And people died like that. In the initial assault, the most deaths occur, like, right away. And then as they get up, it's more of a back and forth fight on a trench system. And that's something, I don't know if you're going to talk about that with it, but when they're fighting, there's a series of trenches at Pointe du Hoc.
Yes, they had to take multiple trenches to kind of secure the location. The German shoulders were shell-shocked because the Texas, even though they did sail some of their artillery shots, they still did hit the, being there, you see it. They put craters all over that cliffside, that hilltop. It's actually that they should get a lot of credit for what happened that day.
Absolutely.
They completely disoriented the Germans that were in the pillboxes up there. But the Germans do reorient themselves. They take up arms and they put up a fierce defense. And they use small arms and mostly grenades from defending these trenches from the Americans trying to take their pillboxes. Also, the Americans are severely running low on ammunition.
Yeah.
They almost completely run out by the end of their 2 days of fighting. And
They're using German weapons after a certain point, and I know there's was it Rudder maybe? He's firing at somebody. He can't even load the German weapon.
Yeah,
So,
he doesn't know how to do it. He doesn't know how to use them.
and so I think when we think of like Pointe du Hoc and we think of D-Day, we forget that a lot of this almost entirely goes wrong. Now it goes right in the sense that we get on the beach and everything else.
Juniors and seniors, if you signed up for Tulane visit today, please go to the conference room in the library during academic lab. Also, a representative from Baylor University will be in the student center during high school lunch today. Stop by to learn more about Baylor.
Anyway,
I also wanted to add that since they were 45 minutes late and the shelling had been going on since 5:30 a.m., the Germans kind of were able to get used to that, and they were ready to put up a fight when the men got there.
and so when we talk about like shelling too, let's keep in mind the Navy on D-Day is going to be spotting these positions where they have these firefights, and they're going to be then shooting artillery over the soldiers in trying to hit the German lines or at least disorientate them. And that's what really saves, and that's from most accounts, what really saves the Rangers on top of Pointe du Hoc is going to be the Navy keeping the Germans from really mustering a big force or putting any armor up there at all. But the big thing, though, and let's talk about this, is the guns, right?
Yep.
They're up there to seize these guns, but what happened with that?
So the guns, well, prior to D-Day, there was a lot of Allied bombardment over for the weeks that were leading into it, a couple days that were leading up
Months.
to it.
Yeah.
So per Douglas Brinkley, it was about 10 kilotons of high explosives that were launched on Pointe du Hoc. So Germany was already weary of an attack on the point. So the German military moved the guns back into a wooded area where it was protected from aerial bombardment. Now, from that position they were in, those guns could still be moved to attack Utah Beach. So when they reach the point and they don't see the guns up there, it's still they're fairly demoralized, but they do end up finding the guns in the wooded area and destroying them. And that's essential to the success on Utah Beach.
Well, there is some debate about that, about whether or not the guns could be effectively transported to their position of fire on the soldiers on Omaha Beach. And had that happen, Omaha Beach was already a bloodbath. To think about how much more death and devastation that 155 millimeter guns could have inflicted on that point, it really makes you wonder, would D-Day have even been successful if these guns would have been in place? But there's a lot of historical debate about how far and how big these guns were. Could the Germans have even undertaken something like that if we wouldn't have assaulted Pointe du Hoc in that morning time?
And then there's also something to consider too. It's snipers, it's machine gunners, light machine gunners that are moved essentially from the bluffs overlooking Omaha to reinforce at Pointe du Hoc. And so there's going to be some movement of German soldiers that has to occur. And so I know some of the military historians that I've dealt with, they tend to look at that as a big pro. Like, hey, this moved X amount of people off that area, and it allowed the Allies to very slowly but get up those bluffs on Omaha Beach.
Well, if we're talking about a diversion, if we were just gonna create a small diversion here to move German soldiers from Pointe du Hoc, we wouldn't have used the Allies wouldn't have used their best of the best soldiers in the
Correct.
army. It would be a waste of lives to create a diversion using the 2nd Ranger Battalion, 225 of the best men in the war period. I think the Allies completely thought the guns were there, and they were going out to get the guns to save lives on Omaha Beach that morning.
Yeah, and I know like you've talked about this. Modern historians have said that there were some intelligence reports that were there, and as we have talked about in this class so far, and as we will continue to talk about, intelligence reports are never 100% accurate, and the idea that they were just going to take a risk when the results could have been catastrophic, I think is kind of like you said, they're doing this for a reason. And if you think about it, like, the highest trained groups on D-Day are the Rangers and the airborne soldiers. They suffer the most casualties because they put them in the toughest positions, and that is intentional. Those are the best soldiers we had. They trained for 2 years for this. So I think there's it's a healthy debate, but I think it's always kind of interesting to kind of look
A lot
at
of
it that way.
hindsight bias, I think, goes into that one.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think that's something we can talk more about is like the perseverance of these men and like the difficulties and the go into specifics on what everything that like went wrong. When we were arriving on the beaches at Pointe du Hoc, and like you mentioned this earlier, we were jumping off out the boats to like go up to the beach, and we were falling into the craters that were like 10 feet deep. From some of them were from our own Navy ships that were going to bomb Pointe du Hoc to push the Germans back. That just happened to miss. And so a lot of our own men had to watch men do that and then keep pushing forward and do everything like that. And we had grappling equipment, but it wasn't anything special. And between all the water and everything, and
I think I read that only half of the grappling equipment was able to function that day. Only half of the stuff they brought ashore was actually able to function.
They had some defective products.
yeah.
Yes.
So the men actually ended up using like their rifles and their bayonets and like using them as ladders to climb this 10-story-foot cliff, which is insane the more you just think about how tall this cliff is. And even more doubts going back to all the way back to the C Company landing on the wrong beach with Captain Goranson.
Yeah, Captain Goranson, he lands by Vierville Draw. He takes a series of trenches there, and he looks out at Pointe du Hoc and sees the fighting taking place, and he thinks his men think the day is completely lost. Lieutenant Solomon, his subordinate, looks over there and says that he thinks that the men are in a really bad spot.
Yeah, further attributing that perseverance, Company C that stayed at Vierville Draw and took that position, they were meant to follow. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment was meant to clear a path for them to where they could flank Pointe du Hoc.
Yeah.
And that company of the 116th is completely wiped out, full casualties of the entire company. And Company C witnesses that, knowing that they do not have a path to Pointe du Hoc, even if they think that they could go help and win this victory that seems highly unlikely to them at the moment. There's no path for them to get there. It would be a suicide mission for them to try to flank that position.
And then you fly over to where Rudder is, and I think Josh was about to say the same thing. He's trying to radio for help.
Right. And he gets back this message, and it's almost eerie when I read this the first time. And he was like, the message read, "All troops are deployed. We can send no reinforcements."
Yeah.
Or something along the lines of that.
And his message was almost out of ammunition, over
Heavy casualties.
Yeah, heavy casualties, need aid now, and they're like, nothing, can't get anything to you. But that's when the Texas does do the shelling. He doesn't get his reinforcements on land, but they do get reinforcements by the Navy. And the Navy are the unsung heroes, I think, of D-Day. For so many reasons, they do a lot of the heavy lifting that takes place to dislodge the Germans.
It took a number of casualties that we never ever hear about on D-Day.
Correct.
But I was going to say is everyone likes to, when talking about Pointe du Hoc, try and think about and put yourself in the position of the soldiers that are climbing that cliff and how arduous a task that must be, and like fighting uphill and fighting Germans in reinforced pillboxes and trenches. Think about the fear of the men in C Company. So they had an interaction with mainly two combat points. First, they saw Company A of the 116th Regiment get completely wiped out, and then they turn to look at their objective while they're fighting. Since Company A of the 116th got wiped out, they're under heavy fire in the areas that A Company was supposed to clear. Then they look off to where their objective is supposed to be, and they see heavy fire there, and they know they're not there assisting people they thought really needed their help. I can only imagine like the amount of terror and fear that they're going through, thinking the day is completely lost.
Because the C Company is thinking their mission was to go to Pointe du Hoc and get those guns that were going to be shooting at the beaches that they're on right now.
Right. So think about that. They're on Omaha Beach. Their job was to go get these guns, destroy these guns, so Omaha Beach wouldn't be completely obliterated. That's a very surreal and scary moment, knowing that like I didn't get to these guns, and now I'm in the line of fire of these guns. I can only imagine like sheer terror, like.
And even through that terror, though, Captain Gorison made the decision to sweep all the trenches and the strongholds. They destroyed machine guns positions that were forced like by small units of Germans into retreat. And so it's like even through all those mistakes and everything that's gone wrong, he's still just like, okay, if we can't do that thing, we're going to move on to the next best thing we should do, and just keep persevering through everything.
And we're talking about like, very hard fighting taking place all the way through the early afternoon, and so it's from the from sun up and until the early afternoon. They are fighting at Verville, which, as we'll learn, and I know Josh knows because he went there, was one of the highest casualty rates of the whole war. Was that landing at Omaha Beach in that section? So they're experiencing horrible combat, and then you're right. They can also, the place where they're supposed to be, they know is also experiencing it, and the radio guys are getting the chatter too on the radio. So that's something to consider.
And I mean, I didn't get to go, and so I'm just curious. I want to ask Josh a few questions about his experience there. I know he's kind of touched on it, but I remember I saw pictures of like the craters, and it looked like they were just everywhere. I just want to know how like that felt like being there.
Yeah, so I was shown pictures, and I was told about these craters and told stories about like how teachers tried to climb in and out of them, and how they're everywhere. And I just like giggled and said, "Wow!" when I saw the pictures. When you're there, it's something completely different. To think that a man-made bombardment did all this, made these like small canyons at the top of this cliff. To think like to try and think about what the German soldiers were experiencing for months on end right there, and just being bombarded and being bombarded, and they wake up 5:30, or they wake up to more bombardment the morning of D-Day at 5:30 a.m. getting hit with these shells, thinking it's going to be another day of just concussion and shell shock. And then this attack comes that they were kind of expecting, but like there was a sense of monotony to it at that point, so that they really weren't expecting it. And it's just the scenery to think like what the U.S. Navy is capable of. There's a path to get to the actual Pointe du Hoc, and it's this winding long path, because it's so hard to build a pathway that isn't interfered by, like straight pathway that doesn't have a giant crater in between you and where you want to go. And that really does set the scene for why so many people want to speak at this place and talk about the men that fought there. Joe Biden recently, for the 80th anniversary of D-Day, he went and spoke there. For the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Ronald Reagan spoke there. Now think about those two figures and how different they were. They stand for almost completely different ideals, and still they both decided to honor the men that fought here, the men that sacrificed there. 75 men died at that place trying to make life easier, trying to make an objective easier for their brothers, to try and save lives of other American soldiers. And the fact that two different men separated by so much time could decide to honor them by speaking there, that says a lot about their perseverance, a lot about their character, a lot about that 2nd Ranger Battalion.
One last thing before we can conclude this. It's kind of a question we've touched on, and we kind of talked about it, but I'm just curious on y'all's stances. Do y'all think it was worth it to send the best of the best to Pointe du Hoc, and even with those losses we've had?
Yeah, I can say that given the fact that intelligence reports, like Coach Arvidas said, are rarely completely accurate, it would have been a huge risk not to contribute the Rangers to this almost impossible task. Because who else could have taken these guns had they been there? I don't see it happening.
Right. To leave that to chance, the possible assault on Omaha and Utah beaches, that could have been catastrophic for the entire invasion of Normandy itself. That would be an incredible risk to take, to just assume that those intelligence reports were 100% accurate and that the guns were not there and that we did not need to send men to secure that spot.
Omaha Beach saw some of the harshest fighting in the entire Normandy campaign. To think that could have been bloodier for the Americans had the guns been up there, that's something that you can't risk if you're Eisenhower. And I think Ike was right to contribute the 2nd Ranger Battalion there, despite the tragedy, despite the casualties, despite losing 75 men, despite 90 only being able to fight a few days later.
I completely agree.
All right. Anybody have anything else? Well, that was a good job, guys. And this was episode 1 of season 5 of Tigers by the Fire. Thank you for listening.